Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, and in this video, I will share about top 10 worst decisions ever made in human history, and after watching the video, you'll learn something from others' mistakes and apply them in your real life. So that the video is not too long, I split it into two parts. There is 4 in the first and 6 in the second. Well, no one is safe from making an occasional mistake here and there, and owning up and apologizing is usually more than enough to fix everything. However, there are those rare instances where people manage to mess up so bad, their terrible decisions make history. So, let's take a look at these worst decisions ever made in history. 1. The worst business decision ever made was by Xerox with their Alto computer. Xerox invented the graphical interface modern computers use. Desktop, folders, copy/paste, etc. They basically invented the modern computer in the 1970s. But the problem was, the people in charge at the time were businessmen without any technical knowledge, so they didn't realize what they had. They did nothing with it and gave it away to universities and showed other companies. The famous story is that Steve Jobs saw this and within 5 minutes realized this was the way computers would work in the future. He copied it, because Xerox didn't patent their invention and didn't do anything with it, and the rest is history. 2. Filling the Hindenburg with hydrogen. By the mid-1930s, rigid airships, commonly known as Zeppelins, had been flying commercial passengers for over 30 years. Tens of thousands of paying passengers had flown over 1 million miles, in over 2,000 flights, without a single injury. Zeppelin's popularity was soaring, and it was widely assumed that they were the wave of the future. The latest milestone was that of Germany's Zeppelin company, whose giant airships flew passengers across the Atlantic in luxury and style, in a mere 60 hours, remarkable for commercial travel back then. On May 6, 1937, after an uneventful transatlantic flight, the Hindenburg tried to dock with a mooring mast in Lakehurst, New Jersey, when it suddenly erupted in flames. It took only 37 seconds from when the first spark appeared for the world's biggest airship to get destroyed by fire. Of 97 people on board, 35 died, and another person died on the ground. Whether an accidental spark or a deliberate shot, the disaster would not have happened if not for the Zeppelin company's disastrous decision to fill its airships with highly flammable hydrogen, instead of a less combustible alternative such as helium. If the Hindenburg had used helium, as airships do today, then neither a spark nor a shot could have reduced it to a flaming wreck in less than a minute. 3. Napoleon invades Russia. One of history's worst decisions was that of French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte to invade Russia in 1812. At the start of that year, Napoleon bestrode Europe like a colossus and was at the height of his power. Then he invaded Russia with about 658,000 men, at the time, the biggest army ever assembled. By year's end, Napoleon had endured a catastrophic defeat, lost most of his men, and began the downward slide that would culminate 2 years later in his exile to St. Helena. The Russian debacle was the result of not just one bad decision, but a whole series of bad decisions. The first bad decision was Napoleon's poor choice of subordinates. His goal was to bend the Tsar to his will by decisively defeating the Russian army as soon as possible. However, Napoleon appointed his unqualified stepson, Prince Eugene, to a major command. Early in the campaign, Napoleon maneuvered the Russians into a situation in which they would be forced to give battle, only for his inexperienced stepson to screw up and allow the Russians to retreat. Napoleon then plunged into Russia, chasing after the Tsar's army. The Russians retreated for hundreds of miles, refusing to give battle and scorching the countryside behind them. The emperor had planned to halt at Smolensk, go into winter quarters, and resume the campaign the following year. Once in Smolensk, however, Napoleon committed his second mistake, by deciding to continue on to Moscow. The Russians finally turned around and offered Napoleon a battle at Borodino, near Moscow. Napoleon won a tough fight, but at the decisive moment, he made his third bad decision by wavering, and refrained from his usual tactic of sending in the elite Imperial Guard, kept in reserve, to finish off the reeling enemy. That prevented the victory from becoming decisive and allowed the battered Russians to live to fight another day. Napoleon marched into Moscow and assumed that the Russians would sue for peace, now that he held their capital. He made his fourth bad decision by waiting in Moscow for Russian peace feelers, as winter drew near. The Russians strung Napoleon along, but no more than Napoleon strung himself along with wishful thinking of a negotiated peace, long after it became clear that the Russians were not interested. By the time he accepted that there would be no peace and marched back to Smolensk, it was too late, and his unprepared army was caught by winter during the retreat. That was exacerbated by Napoleon's final bad decision, in his choice of route. Napoleon had the choice of 2 routes, and ended up taking the one that was struck by severe winter storms. The route he did not take saw little snow that year. Most of Napoleon's army starved or froze to death, or were killed by Cossacks. The French emperor had marched into Russia with a grand army numbering 685,000 soldiers. He came out with only 35,000 Frenchmen still under his command, with the remainder either dead, over 400,000, deserting, or switching sides. 4. The Titanic's many bad choices. More than a century ago, the Reims Titanic set sail on her maiden voyage across the North Atlantic. But just 5 days into the trip from England to New York City, the luxury liner collided with an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland. Consumed by damage, she sank, killing more than 1,500 passengers and crew. Multiple mistakes were made that collectively sent the Titanic to its tragic end in April 1912. First, there were no safety regulations in place for a ship as large as the Titanic. It didn't carry adequate safety equipment. For example, there were only 16 lifeboats, enough for only about 1/3 to 1/2 of the passengers on board, and crew members weren't prepared with binoculars or proper lighting. Additionally, the Titanic was untested. Sure, they'd reviewed the ship's equipment, but it was never test-driven. It was unproven. The crew was not fully up to speed on the liner, its equipment, such as the state-of-the-art Marconi wireless messaging system, and its emergency procedures. Despite how unprepared the Titanic was operationally, it may have been a simple human error that ultimately caused the iceberg disaster. In 2010, it was revealed that the helmsman may have made a steering error when diverting the ship around the iceberg, and the turn wasn't corrected in time to avoid disaster. The iceberg was spotted just before midnight, and by 2:20 a.m. the Titanic had split and sunk. Thanks for watching, and see you in the second part of this topic.